4:10, and I think we're ready to begin. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ed Foster-Corbett in the Foster Department, and it is my honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jane Harris. And I know you're mostly interested in her and the story she's going to tell. I'm still going to take a point of privilege to say a few words about her because I think this is when I'm going to get to do it. And so I had the privilege of being on the search committee when Jane interviewed here. And what I want to say is we knew, right? We knew that she was going to be a good teacher. I can remember sitting there in her classroom, in her example class, going, yeah, she's going to do well. This is going to be great. And it's really turned out to be that way. What I maybe didn't predict was the way in which Jane was going to fill the halls of the old Rainey building with such lovely laughter, right? She has one of the best laughs of anybody, and it really added to the community that we had there. And for a few years, I had to move into another building to do some Lilly work in Miller Center, and I didn't have that opportunity to be with Jane on as much of a daily basis. But about 4 years ago, have we taught for 4 years together?
We have, yeah.
Jane and I began teaching the Engaged Citizen together, and some of your alumni, I don't know if you know about the class, but we found it replaced WIT, or if you're the Journeys generation, take your pick. And faculty get together and design a class, and Jane and I taught the Engaged Citizen, Religion and Democracy in the U.S. And everything that I thought Jane would be in that interview, I got to see firsthand how much it was the case. Her excellence in teaching, and beyond that, what I really want to say is her compassion. When Jane and I would discuss a student, or discuss an issue, or discuss what needed to be done, Jane has this compass that goes immediately towards the compassionate, the caring, the right. And whereas I, as a kind of philosopher, I hope I have that, but it's sort of like, huh? Can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? And for Jane, there was always this clarity of guidance that I really respected. And so I began by saying it's my honor to introduce her. And what I want to say is that Jane is a person of honor. And across this campus, you can see ways that we can't even name, that her integrity, her stability of insight about what needs to be done, and her care for this place is seen in many different ways. And so it's an honor to have you speak.
This is not a scholarly lecture. I'm going to walk down memory lane and drag you along with me. I have been thinking about, Jay said, 50 years. Well, actually, I started my academic study of religion the fall of 1970. That was 49 years ago. So almost 50 years, not quite 50 years of studying religion. And so I've just gone back and thought about the places that I've studied, the things that I've studied, how all of that led me here in the fall of 1990, and how I've spent these 29 years studying here and learning from my colleagues, and continuing to grow, I hope, both as a student of religion and certainly, I think, grown as a human being because of this place and the people that I've gotten to work with over the years. Okay, so here we go. 1970 to 74. Y'all stop me along the way, ask questions, interject, but I'm calling it was kind of the worst and the best of times for me because the college years were wonderful. But, you know, when you look at what was going on in the world between 1970 and 74, not the best of times. Certainly Vietnam was still raging. In August of 1974, or 1970, the Kent State incident, so there was a lot of anxiety, you know, around what was going on in higher education settings during that time. The women's movement was certainly on the radar screen, probably not so much in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the places that were important in my life, but still, I mean, the beginnings of the women's movement really moving into southern settings and beginning to affect things. That was happening. There's some pretty good music coming out of the 60s and early 70s, so, you know, there culturally, for those of us who love music, it was a rich time musically. Politically, maybe not the best of times. Nixon was in his second year of his administration after being elected in '68. The picture in the middle, bottom middle, that's Meredith College, and I'm going to talk about that place and its influence in my life in just a minute. Had to put a basketball picture up there. Chuck Chapel knows I love North Carolina basketball.
Did you? I didn't realize that. You got on Tar Heel Blue today.
Yeah, sort of. But it was a pretty interesting time in North Carolina. Dean Smith was early in his career as coach at North Carolina, and in 1970, Charlie Scott was his first African-American player recruited to play for Carolina. He was a pretty good player, and actually got to see him play some ball. That was one of the nice things about being in school in Raleigh. I saw some good college basketball over those years. So in that fall of 1970, I entered a small liberal arts college for women called Meredith College in Raleigh, North Carolina. It was at that time affiliated with the North Carolina Baptist Convention. It broke those ties in the early 80s when lots of changes were going on in Baptist life. But during the time that I was there, it was affiliated with the North Carolina Baptist Convention. And one of the things I found out moving west of the Mississippi, that Baptist life west of the Mississippi was really different from the kind of Baptist life I grew up with in North Carolina. And so Meredith was a really wonderful place to study religion. It was a place where there were some family ties. My dad's sister, my Aunt Virginia, had gone to Meredith and graduated from there. I had another great aunt who had not graduated from Meredith but had gone to school there for a couple of years. I loved Raleigh, North Carolina. Had a lot of childhood occasions in Raleigh. But 2 years before I started college in the fall of 68, my family had moved to Greenville, South Carolina. And I couldn't wait to get back to North Carolina. And when I had considered other institutions where I might want to study, Meredith was the place that emerged as a good fit for a very, very shy, reserved young woman turning 18 and starting college. And so I ended up at Meredith, and it turned out to be a good place for me. It was small, about 1,200 students at that time, and a real liberal arts institution, and it was fun. I actually found online an old catalog, so I went back and looked. What were our general education requirements then? And when I looked at them, I thought, gosh, that sounds a whole lot like the distribution requirements when I got to Hendrix in 1990. We had to study in the natural sciences and the social sciences and the humanities. We had to have 2 years of languages. And so, there was a breadth of study required of us. I hadn't planned to major in religion. I had grown up in the church, and so I thought, I knew a fair amount about the Bible and had gone to Sunday school all my life. But at Meredith, we were required to take 2 religion classes, so that was part of the general ed requirement for everybody, whether you majored in religion or not. So I had to take a religion class. I took one the fall semester of my freshman year. It was my favorite class. It was an introduction to the Bible. The whole Bible in one semester. So, it was a marathon introduction. I loved it. I loved it. And probably because it brought together the 2 things that I had loved most in high school, which were English and history. And so, unbeknownst to me, religious studies was a great fit for somebody who was interested in a number of different areas, and this course really brought those things together. So the interdisciplinary nature of religion suited me. I couldn't have articulated that in the fall of 1970, but over the years I've come to realize that interdisciplinary nature of what we do in religious studies was just a fit for somebody who has a lot of different interests. And so I began the study of religion that fall with that first introduction to Bible. And then my second course was called The Religions of Man. I don't remember a whole lot of content of the course. I remember the book, The Religions of Man by Noss. I loved that course. You're smiling. It's been around a long time. I still have it on my shelf in my office. It's dense, but it was a great class. And at that particular time, undergraduate religious studies departments were offering some courses in comparative religion. So comparative religion was moving into the curriculum in undergraduate studies of religion. and moving away is some of my research on the history of religion departments and history of the study of religion has shown, moving away from the model of sort of undergraduate replication of divinity school curricula and moving to a curriculum more suited to undergraduate and university and college settings. And adding the comparative religions was something that religion departments in colleges and universities were doing. And so in 1970, Meredith students were able to take this course that looked at the major world religions. And I took it with one of the professors that became really important to me, Ralph McLean, and I loved my religion classes. So I thought about majoring in music. No, when I looked at the Bachelor of Music degree, it was way too focused and too narrow. I would have spent all my time in the practice rooms, and I just decided, no, I'd take some voice lessons. I sang in an ensemble, and that satisfied my love for the music, and I was about exploring other things. And hadn't expected to fall in love with the study of religion, but did. Had great teachers. Interestingly, I did not have a female teacher at this women's college in religious studies. I had female teachers in history. My econ teacher was a female. My sociology teacher was female. Most of my English teachers were female. I thought about majoring in English, but Dr. Rose, who taught Shakespeare, scared me. I did take her course on Shakespearean tragedies. It was one of the best classes I ever took, and the proudest B I ever earned in my life. But the English faculty were known to be intimidating. I know they're not anymore, you are. But they were at Meredith. They were the giants. The two, Dr. Knight and Dr. Rose, were both graduates of Meredith and had degrees from Columbia, and I can't remember where Dr. Knight, maybe Duke. Anyway, they were scary. But I loved them both dearly. Came to work closely with them and had classes with Dr. Rose. Didn't have a class with Dr. Knight. But I could do literature in religious studies, and I did enjoy some biblical studies courses. Kind of explored sort of broadly in my undergraduate curriculum. We didn't have a concentration, unlike we ask our religious studies majors to have a concentration now. I kind of explored widely. We didn't have Odyssey kinds of programs at Meredith, but I think it was my junior year, some of my peers and I did a service project in a low-income neighborhood in Raleigh. We would get up early on a couple of mornings each week and go help prepare breakfast for school children in that low-income neighborhood. So we were doing kind of our service to the world project ourselves, not something that the college had created for us, but something that we did. And then we didn't do a lot of study abroad in the early 1970s. Maybe you were doing that at Hendrix, but we were not doing that at that point in time so much at Meredith. Now they have a really wonderful international studies program, but that was not something that I did at that point. So that was the beginning of my falling in love with the study of religion, and now 49 years later, I still love it, and am grateful for those opportunities. I left Raleigh after graduation in 1974, and I went to Kaohsiung, Taiwan. That was a huge change. From a city, Raleigh maybe had about 120,000 population, to a city in southern Taiwan of over 1 million people.
Wow.
I was teaching at National Kaohsiung Normal University, or the Teachers College. I taught English there, and at a couple of other technical schools teaching English. Also working through a Baptist student ministry program with college students in a Baptist church there in Kaohsiung. So it was an interesting time of studying Chinese, of teaching English to Chinese college students, of learning a lot about religion. Here were some of my students in Kaohsiung and my colleagues there, and I've stayed in touch now over 40 years with some of those students that I taught and that were part of the student ministry program. that I was involved in. So, in fact, several weeks ago, I had a dear friend, my colleague, in one of the pictures, that I had a good friend for over 40 years, who died, and a bunch of us who had been together in Taiwan got back together for her funeral. And I saw one of my former students, I had not seen in over 40 years, but we kind of stayed in touch. So the people and the experiences that took place in Taiwan have been profoundly important in my own life. And what I learned about religion, let's see, here you go. What I learned about religion was important. So I learned about Christianity in a global context, Christianity in a Chinese setting. I attended a church and worshiped in Chinese, and found, as I learned a little more Chinese, that enriched my understanding of how you translate theology and the Bible into a different context, and that was really a significant experience. I also spent a lot of time just wandering through Buddhist temples and little neighborhood temples in Taiwan that would have Buddhist and Taoist and Confucian elements all melded together in one of those little temples. There would often be what were called bye-byes, rituals that were just out on the street, maybe honoring a loved one who had died or something. So I saw Chinese religion day in and day out, and learned a lot about Chinese religious traditions from living in Taiwan and living in Kaohsiung for those 2 years. And also having a chance while I was in Asia to travel pretty widely. Went to Hong Kong a number of times, but to Thailand and to Sri Lanka and India. And so learned a lot about religious traditions that I'd read about as a freshman in college, and now getting to see up close and talking to my Chinese students about their own religious backgrounds. That was a powerful experience of immersion in a religious culture. And so I'm grateful for, when I read a book now, I have places and smells and sights that relate to the things that I read and teach. And I love teaching the world religions class here because I continue to learn about these traditions, many of which I've had the privilege of being able to see. And that's been valuable for me. So I left Taiwan in 1976. Actually, I returned to the United States on July the 3rd, 1976, purposefully returning after those 2 years in Asia to be back for July 4th, 1976. So was here for that bicentennial celebration. But I needed a job, and I wasn't ready to go back to school at that point. I figured at some point I would probably go to, maybe to seminary, was what I was thinking. But I needed a job, and that summer I did get a job in Dillon, South Carolina, about 60 miles north, sort of north and west of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I will confess I had more culture shock going to Dillon than I did going to Taiwan. It was really a challenging experience. Challenging, it was a rural area, and for the last 6 years, and really for the last 8 years, because Greenville, South Carolina is a fairly good sized place, even in 1970. But coming from a city of 1 million people where I had been living, to a place of about 10,000 in very poor area of South Carolina was a real challenge. Another challenge, I was teaching 8th grade. I had taken 8th grade language arts and social studies was what I was assigned to teach at J.B. Martin Junior High School. That's the high school. It's now not used as a high school. It was built in 1896. And functioned as the junior high school for many years. It was last used in 2007, I have found out. And they're trying to preserve the building simply because it has some historic value in the little town of Dillon. But I was teaching in that building in 1976 to 1978, teaching English and social studies. Now, I had taken, I had been certified to teach in North Carolina. I'd taken 10 hours of English and history, and had been teaching English in a Chinese college for 2 years. I'm here to tell you none of that prepared me to teach 8th grade. And I decided after 2 years that 8th grade teachers were saints, and I was not one. I was not cut out to teach 8th grade. But I learned a lot about teaching during those 2 years. And I'm grateful, have lifelong friends from those 2 years in Dillon, South Carolina. But I must say it was the hardest job I have ever had in my life. And I tremendously respect middle school teachers today. I think they are remarkably good, strong people, and they have to be really passionate about teaching to teach at that level. So I left in '78, and I went back to North Carolina to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Unbeknownst to those of us who were in school there in 1978, we were going to be part of a wrenching time in Baptist life as the beginning of the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention got underway within the first year of our seminary experience. And Southeastern Seminary was the first seminary that the conservatives targeted in terms of taking control of the seminary because it was regarded as more progressive. And one indication of that was we had the largest percentage of women in the student population of any of the seminaries. We didn't have as many students altogether as Southern Seminary or Southwestern Seminary, but percentage-wise, there were more females in our program. And nobody asked me if I was going to be a Master of Religious Studies student, because I wanted to do the Master of Divinity program. And in other seminaries, that would have been much harder for me to do that. They would have kind of expected as a female that I would be going into a Master of Religious Education program, which was not my intention at that time. I kind of thought when I got to seminary that I would prepare and maybe go back overseas and teach in a seminary somewhere overseas. In fact, there was a seminary in Rusch-le-Can, Switzerland. At that time, the International Baptist Seminary for European Baptists was in Rusch-le-Can, and I had met one of the professors there as an undergraduate, was really impressed with what he was doing, and you know, Switzerland sounded like a pretty wonderful place to teach. And so I kind of imagined myself getting my Master of Divinity degree, maybe going on and at some point teaching in a Baptist seminary somewhere in the world. But as I said, it was a wrenching time for a seminarian. But even with all of that, I loved studying biblical studies. And I think part of it was I had studied Chinese when I was living in Taiwan. I loved studying the languages. As a biblical studies student, you would study Hebrew and Greek, and that excited me. And so that's where I concentrated my study of religion in seminary, was in the biblical studies track. Seminary curricula were, at least at that time in Baptist seminaries, had sort of 4 emphases: the biblical studies, historical studies, theological studies, and sort of pastoral studies. And as a seminarian in the MDiv program, you were taking courses in all of those areas, but then you could focus more of your study. And so I, again, didn't go in intending maybe to be a biblical studies student, but that's where the teachers were really excellent, and I just kind of fell in love with Greek at first. Chad and I were talking about this the other day. Greek was my first language, and somebody told me years later that usually your first biblical language is the one you kind of love, and the second language that you tackle maybe not love quite so much. Well, that was my experience. I loved Greek, mainly because of its precision, but I loved the Old Testament, and Hebrew, while it was more challenging, I just love the Old Testament. Its earthiness, its poetry, its narratives. So I was a biblical studies student, and my Old Testament professor tried to convince me as I was graduating that I needed to go to Hebrew Union and study more Old Testament and do my doctorate in Old Testament. But I didn't want to study Ugaritic and Aramaic and continue, the Hebrew at that level. I was beginning to realize my inclination was more as a kind of generalist. I liked the breadth of things that I could study in religious studies, and the prospect of becoming so very focused on biblical studies, particularly in Old Testament. As much as I loved it, and still do, I just couldn't see myself becoming an expert in that area. And so I took a little bit of a break for a year after seminary and worked in the bookstore on campus, took an advanced Hebrew class just for fun.
Don't we all?
And did a little bit, just had fun, and it was a lot of fun. But then decided that I wanted to go into graduate school, and I had done some work in religion and literature. Took a course at the seminary under one of our theology faculty, and really loved. I've always loved to read. I loved that course in particular, and saw that the continuation of the study of literature, which I had enjoyed in my biblical studies work, would be something that I could continue in doing, sort of a religion and literature program. So that brought me to the University of Virginia. And it didn't take me long to realize that literary criticism was not my forte. It was just, I wasn't a literary critic. I had background, from my undergraduate work in English, and certainly a lot of exposure to exegesis and literary sorts of analysis in biblical studies. But when I got to UVA, it was clear that was just not a good fit for me. And so I didn't finish my master's. I had done all of my coursework, my language requirement, and had started my master's thesis and just kind of abandoned that. But I did leave with two writers that I became acquainted with during those years at UVA. Barbara Pym, a British writer whose work I really just love, and Denise Levertov, a poet, a British-American poet, whose work I became acquainted with. In fact, I started my master's thesis on Levertov, and maybe one day I'll go back and do something with that, but anyway. So I left with some writers that I have grown to treasure over the years, but realized that of the many things I might imagine myself being a literary critic was not what I was equipped to do very well. So I went back to North Carolina. Okay, there's a theme here. I keep going back to North Carolina. And for a couple of years I worked in the University Baptist Church in Chapel Hill on their staff. And I realized I'm not a parish minister, and I was doing Christian education there. I was invited back to Meredith to teach a course one spring semester while I was in Chapel Hill. And I walked out of the first class that I was teaching at Meredith as an adjunct, and I said, I'm going back to school. I want to be in the college classroom. And fortunately, the University of North Carolina was across the street from the University Baptist Church where I was working. So I walked across the street into Grant Wacker's office, and I told him, I really, I love history, I love literature, want to be in graduate school. And he said, okay, let's make that happen. And this was in 1986. UNC had a master's program in religious studies for years. I was in the first class of students admitted into a doctoral program in religious studies in '86. And there were, I can't remember, maybe 6 of us that were entering in at that point in time. Little did I realize that the late 80s were kind of a really dynamic time for people who were studying American religion. Grant Wacker, really wonderful American religious historian, and probably the most extraordinary advisor I've ever had. His concern for his students, his pushing us, but at the same time having compassion for us. My mother died the spring of my first year in grad school, and Grant worked with me to get me through that period. He's just a great teacher. which is not always true in graduate school, as some of us know. Brilliant minds are not always the greatest teachers, and I studied with some extraordinary people, both at UNC and in UVA, and not all of them were fantastic teachers, even though their work was brilliant and really important for me to read and understand, but in the classroom they were not the best. Grant is just a fabulous American religious historian, an incredible teacher, and an extraordinary human being. So getting to work with him was just beyond fantastic. And so I started studying American religion. Realized, I love history. I'm pretty good at thinking historically and looking at things from that perspective. And in the late 1980s, there was a lot of interesting stuff going on in American religion, moving away from sort of the focus on denominational histories, which had been a large part of the focus on Protestant denominations in so much of what had gone on in American religious history for many years, and beginning to look at pluralistic approaches to American religion. Mormonism became important for American religious historians to address, analytically and to look at, both from insider and outsider perspectives. So that was interesting work that was going on. More interest in gender, interest in women's role in American religion, looking at women in volunteer movements, women in the American missionary movement, women raising issues about ordination, made people go back and look at women's role in those issues. So it was a really exciting time and expansion of questions and focus for historians of American religion. And at that particular time, the late 80s, we're coming out of the scandals in evangelicalism. Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, and in North Carolina, I mean, that was kind of a big deal. There were the rise of the political influence of the moral majority and the Christian coalition. And so all of a sudden, American religious historians are interested in what is going on with evangelicalism, and going back and looking at its history and looking at how that history led us to where we were in the late 80s with the growing cultural influence of evangelicalism, again, in American life, as that influence had certainly been evident 100 years earlier. So it was a kind of fun time to be doing American religion, and working with a great dissertation advisor who was a wonderful teacher, having the chance at UNC to study with historians. I worked with Don Matthews and Jacqueline Dowd Hall in the history department at UNC. They focused mainly on Southern religion, and Jacqueline Dowd Hall had done some really interesting work on women in Southern religion, and some interesting work on the mill culture and textile mills and textile industry. And so she was doing some social history. So I got to work with historians who were, again, expanding the kind of historiography that was being done, and then being able to see how that might be applied to our understanding of American religious culture. So that was a lot of fun. Took a great class in the Department of Sociology. It was a seminar taught by a sociologist and a political scientist on Southern regionalism. John Shelton Reed and Earl, what was his name? Anyway, two great scholars that were teaching this combination of a course on the South. Which was just a lot of fun. So I discovered history in a great setting where I was being taught by just wonderful scholars, and I was just having graduate school was fun, and I had not had fun at UVA. I was having fun in Carolina in what I was studying and the people that I was getting to work with, and it was just a really fantastic time. I had said that I didn't have a female teacher as an undergraduate. I didn't have a female instructor in seminary. At UVA, there were some women in the religious studies department, but not in my area. They were teaching history of religions and Buddhist studies, and I didn't work with them. At UNC, my major professors were all male except Jacqueline Dowd Hall in the history department. I had some work with her. And then an American religious historian did join the faculty at UNC, Laurie Maffley Kipp. But she left, or I was in the process of leaving as she was arriving. I had finished all of my coursework, and so did not get to study with her. I had one last seminar in history of religions with a female scholar who was only at UNC for just a short time. Tomoko Masazawa, I don't know if you know her work, Bill, but I had one seminar with her. She was the first woman scholar of religion with whom I had the opportunity to study in all of those years of studying religion. And I remember going to some early academic meetings and sitting in a room, and I would be the only female in that particular session. So women did make up a lot of the scholars in religious studies. And certainly I didn't have a chance until very late, and not even in my own particular field, to study with a woman who was modeling, what I hoped to do. So that was an interesting part of my own study of religion, that women were just not a large part of that field. When I came to deciding on my dissertation, I remember I was working on a paper, and I can't remember for what class. It may have been a class for Don Matthews in history. He taught a course on women in American history. And I was working on a paper for him, and I was doing some research in a reference book on women, notable American women. And I kept coming across, just in what I was looking at, reference to this school called the North China Union Women's College, and I kind of got interested. Well, where was that? And then I began to see some women's names coming up, and so when I went back to Grant and said, kind of interested in this college in China and some missionary institution, and there are several women's names that keep coming up. He said, well, why don't you go see if anybody's written on it? And as I discovered, as I was looking for a dissertation topic, that nothing had been written on this particular institution. So I decided to write about the three missionary women educators. These three women who were instrumental in beginning and sustaining the college from 1901 until Margaret Bailey Spear was interned by the Japanese in the late 40s, during the period, or mid 40s, and then once she was released from basically being in prison with the faculty at the college, she stayed on in China until the communists in '49 basically made all the missionaries leave, and so she left China. So she was a really interesting figure. So I ended up basically spending several years with these women, writing their story, writing about the institution that they had been so much a part of in China, and wrote about the transformations in their own lives by virtue of their years in China and of their role in women's education in China. And I think many of us talk about a lot of times history is just autobiography in many ways. And this, when I step back and look at it, it certainly was true in my own life. I had gone to a women's college, so I was kind of drawn to looking at this women's college. I'd spent some time in Asia, in Taiwan, and absorbed in Chinese culture. And here was an institution in Beijing. And it was bringing together a lot of things, examining the transformative experience that a missionary goes through when they spend their lives in a different cultural context, how it shapes their own theology, how it shapes their own experience of themselves and their own identity. In many ways, these women were, they were in a culture that was not their own in China. Luella Minor died in China. Alice Brown Frame became ill with cancer and had to come back to the United States. She didn't want to do that. She wanted to stay in China, but basically her mission sort of required that she return to the United States once her health became quite unstable. And Margaret Bailey Spear, of course, was forced to leave China with the communists coming into power in 1949. But all of them were they were never really at home back in the United States. These are people caught between cultures in so many ways. And so I found their lives just really interesting. And so the dissertation was in a lot of ways trying to work out some of my own experiences through coming to understand historically their lives and their experiences in the early part of the 20th century. So I spent some years working on that dissertation. And then, in 1990, this college took a risk on me. I had not finished that dissertation. I was still writing that thing when Hendrix offered me the position here. And you know, here I am, 29 years later, and these guys have let me work with them and learn from them and enjoy all the years of being able, again, to be kind of a generalist. Hendrix has let me teach a lot of wonderful things over the years that I have loved to study. I've taught a little bit in biblical studies, so drawing out of those seminary years and that continued love for studying the Bible literarily and historically. I loved teaching American religions, so I've gotten to do that over the years. And I guess for 29 years I've taught world religions, and so I keep getting to revisit Asia. And while I was in seminary, I got to spend a summer in Israel doing some archaeological work. So when we talk about Jerusalem, you know, I've been to Jerusalem, climbing up to Jerusalem at sunset, and when they talk about Golden Jerusalem, it really is true. It's just an extraordinary sort of experience. So when I teach world religions, I get to go back to these places that I visited and that I love. And so Hendrix has been a great place for this person who's wandered around the study of religion for a long time and gotten to continue to love and study and learn from my colleagues. And so I'm just grateful for these 29 years. So let me stop. We've got a few minutes maybe?
Yep. We go until 10 after. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll be glad to answer questions or, please. Yeah, Chuck.
Are you aware Denise Levertov has taught at Hendrix College?
I knew she had been here.
She was one of the first Murphy visitors. The Murphy program was established in 1978, and I think it was 1980.
Wow.
She came for us. We had the 333 system.
Yeah, oh yeah.
You remember it.
I do remember it,
She
yes.
taught for, I think it was the winter term, I believe.
Oh.
I can't remember. Jay,
Yeah.
is that what it
I remember
was?
her teaching, remember her presence,
Yeah, and she gave several public lectures, and she's, maybe it's destiny, Jane, because she's been in this place, in this house when it was the president's home for dinners.
Wow.
Where I also attended and listened to her talk. And a brilliant woman and a formidable woman, let me put it that way.
I bet she was, yeah.
Well, she was a formidable woman.
I could imagine that just for reading her poetry. But her Candles in Babylon collection of poems is just one of my favorite volumes of poems.
She taught creative writing, poetry, and she taught a course in, I guess it would be, in American women poets to English major, to advanced students.
Wow.
And it was sat in on a couple of those.
I would love to have been in that class. Wow.
That was a great benefit of the Murphy program.
That's
Destiny
fantastic.
for you, Stacey.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
Two-part question.
sure.
In your nearly 50-year involvement with religious studies, first of all, do you think the world has become more, less, or the same in terms of religiousness? And secondly, do you think religions have converged or diverged?
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Where are we? I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think, and Jay, jump in. Jay thinks a lot about these questions too. So, I think we are, in an age where religion is still very much a part of our cultural fabric, you know, it is. It's just part of the culture. Now, some things, interesting things are happening. If you look at the demographics and, you know, researchers who are looking at how people identify religiously today, a lot of people are identifying as nuns in terms of their, you know, saying I'm Methodist or Baptist or Episcopalian or Presbyterian or Catholic. You know, no, they're not taking on those labels. But at the same time, there's a lot of interest in what people are calling spirituality. People are still interested in those fundamental questions about who are we? What's the meaning of life? Where, you know, where are we headed? So I don't think we have lost interest in those questions. I think that people may be finding different kinds of communities in which they are dealing with those questions rather than in communities that are part of what we would call institutionalized religious bodies. There seems to be a resistance to some of that. And there are lots of studies that are trying to look at, you know, why is that the case? In fact, my American religion students were reading a book right now entitled Without God, Without Creed. Historians trying to examine, you know, what were the cultural influences on the rise of the whole idea that God does not exist? You know, what were those influences in American life, particularly in the 19th century? He's arguing that led to people even entertaining that as a possibility to jettison that idea that God exists. And so maybe we're at a point where people might say they believe in God, but they are certainly not going to be part of a community that self-identifies as a religious body. So I don't know that people are less they're as spiritual perhaps as they've always been, but less self-identified religiously for a variety of reasons. Some will say that religion, perhaps this began in the 70s and through the 80s, and that religion became so identified politically that turned a lot of people away from religious identification because it carried political overtones with which people were not comfortable identifying. So there are a lot of factors that may have led us to the place where people are saying, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. So I'm hard pressed to say that we're less spiritually oriented, less concerned about things of the spirit today than we've ever been. I mean, if you go back and look at even the 16th and 17th century, and even early 19th century, in the South, for example, we were not terribly religious, in part because there wasn't a whole structure for religious life in the 1700s in the South. People were scattered. There weren't at that time until the Revolution. You had Anglican churches without priests. You had populations that couldn't get to the churches that exist, so they weren't terribly religious when you go back and look historically at various periods in American life. So it's kind of hard to say we're less religious today than folks were 300 years ago when there were lots of obstacles to them acting out of their religious identifications. So it's still kind of an interesting time to be exploring religion in an American context. Yeah.
You talked earlier about your studies kind of pursuing and taking an interest in a lot of topics or areas that were being perhaps neglected or really pursued widely for the first time. I'm curious, are there any topics or areas today that you feel are being sort of neglected or waiting for greater study?
Oh, well, there's an awful. If you look at the program for the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion, oh my goodness, I can't imagine topics that aren't covered. Everything from animals and the role of animals and theologies related to animals, so certainly the environment, just many different perspectives on the environment. Queer theory, lesbian, gay, lesbian, transgender issues are certainly topics of discussion with sessions in the Academy of Religion that are taking those issues and those communities seriously and looking at their experiences and writing about those. So gender, issues around sexual orientation, these are all issues that are being addressed in the Academy today and in religious studies departments and courses. So Jay, help me out. What are we not? Popular culture. We have students who graduated from Hendrix. I'm thinking of Dan Clanton, who's doing some really interesting work now on the Bible and popular culture. Taking seriously images and themes coming out of popular culture from comics. Looking at comics seriously as artifacts that tell us something about theology and something about religious concerns. So we have our graduates who are doing some really interesting work. I'm also thinking about Rachel Wagner, who teaches at Ithaca College in New York.
She's actually watching from.
Hi, Rachel.
Great. So she's been listening.
Rachel's doing some great work on popular religion and popular culture. So, there are just so many things that are being covered today that were not covered when I was an undergraduate in religion. So I'm sure there are things we're not dealing with. Yeah.
Well, so you taught so many courses that I wish I could have taken, including your world religion course, which you did a great job teaching.
Oh, thanks.
But for example, you taught religion and food.
Yeah.
And would you have thought about teaching that course 20 years ago?
No.
And what shifted in you such that it was natural to teach that 20 years later?
Well, again, going to the American Academy of Religion and hearing a panel doing some work on religion and food, and all of a sudden you realize, oh wow, this is a way to talk about various religious traditions through their food. In Judaism, food's really important. But then you look, one book that we read this past semester when I taught that course, African American tradition has a rich tradition of food that has a sort of sacramental meaning about it. And all of a sudden food becomes a way of looking at various religious traditions and also subcultures within an American context through something that is just as ordinary as it can be, as essential as food, and yet when you reflect on it theologically, when you look at the role that food plays ritually, it's a whole new way of thinking about religion from something that's ordinary, essential, and distinctive in many different religious traditions. It was just another way of doing world religions in a way, of looking at religion and culture, and asking some questions that I hadn't thought about until I began to think about food as one of those lenses through which you can begin to look at religion and culture and ordinary lives. It's part of, I think, that move away from so much focusing on theology and history to looking at just ordinary lives and the ordinary ways in which religion becomes a part of our lives. When we sit down to a meal, people who say a blessing, and may not stop always to think about the religious nature of that. It's just, it becomes habitual in some ways, but it has religious significance behind it. Or the role that bread, when you look at breads in various traditions, how fundamental that is to diets, but also how laden with religious meaning it has in certain contexts. It's just a really significant way of looking at religion through something very ordinary that takes on special significance when you begin to ask questions that I hadn't thought to ask until I began to read after going to that session and just be really kind of excited about this new way of thinking about religion and culture and ordinary people and how religion matters in their lives and in ways that we might not stop to think about until we stop to think about it. Then it becomes really fascinating. So I was inspired by a panel at the AAR one year and then began to realize, oh my goodness, there was just a lot of literature that began to emerge by people who were thinking about these issues, and became a lot of fun actually.
Oh,
Other things?
can you see that?
Hi, Jane. I just wanted to really thank you for your wonderful presentation. It was just marvelous. And I'm particularly thrilled that the students in the room could hear it, because I think when you talked about the path you took, it was so interesting to see a sort of a pleasing lack of linearity. Words, but not linearity was sort of the theme of what you talked about, and I really loved that. I was struck, until yesterday I didn't know that you taught school, in Dillon, South Carolina. I was thrilled to know about your history with Taiwan and so forth, so how adventurous you were in trying out these paths. What a lifelong learner you've been, how you've continued to challenge yourselves and seek what makes sense, how thoughtful and reflective you've been through all this. And what surprised me in light of that is throughout this, over those 50 years, you have remained true to this blind devotion to Tar Heels basketball. And through all the scandals and all the bad seasons, you have been given so many opportunities to reflect and find a better path than what you have. Could you talk about the importance of that in your life?
It's a Jayhawk talking.
Well, just saying.
We do share something in common, Phil. Roy Williams and Dean Smith. That began when I was about 12 years old. I don't know what it was. A group of friends, we kind of got interested in basketball. This was around 1960 or so. Frank McGuire was still coaching at Carolina at that point in time. Maybe it was just the cute guys running around in really short britches on the basketball. Who knows what brought this 12-year-old? But okay, all right. But I also grew up in North Carolina. In North Carolina, you're either a Tar Heel fan, a North Carolina State Wolfpack fan, Wake Forest Demon Deacon fan, or a Blue Devil. Duke Blue Devil. But they were the big four. Every year there was a Big Four tournament. These four teams played ball in North Carolina. If you grow up there, you kind of grow up loving basketball and picking your team. Now, in my family, all the men graduated from North Carolina State. My dad, his brother, my cousins, my uncle. And so when I went to Carolina, I didn't hear the end of that from the family. But the love of Tar Heel basketball began as a 12-year-old, and I don't think it'll ever, I'll die, as the old saying goes. I'm a Tar Heel born, a Tar Heel bred, and when I die, I'm a Tar Heel dead. That's the truth.
That's so true. Dr. Ken Story, who had the late Dr. Ken Story, he cared nothing about sports at all, except Duke and North Carolina basketball and Central North Carolina basketball. He'd watch it all the time, but he didn't know what a Razorback was, or even a Warrior. He had no idea. But he grew up in
Stanley County, North Carolina. I know. Go ahead.
Well, I think we have time for one more question, and I saw.
I wanted to ask if you'd share a little bit about how your teaching of religion or study of religion then impacted your personal faith journey and your,
that was the last question in 2 minutes. Okay.
Okay. I'm now an Episcopalian. I was born in North Carolina, grew up in North Carolina Baptist churches. Like I said, when I got west of the Mississippi, Baptist life is really different out here, and I could tell you the historical reasons that I think that's so, but that would take a while, and we don't have time for that. But I was moving away, even in seminary. well, even in college, I went to some Presbyterian churches in North Carolina because the First Presbyterian Church had a great Scottish preacher when I was an undergraduate. He was wonderful. Al Edwards was fantastic. Great preacher and had a wonderful Scottish brogue. And I enjoyed that congregation. I enjoyed that pastor. But, you know, I was still, you know, very Baptist at that point in time. And even overseas in the Chinese Baptist churches, you know, I love those people, and Christianity in another context is really interesting to see the translation of theology in that context, and I found that exciting. And you know, I was good being a Baptist in Taiwan. When I got back to the States, I think that was when things were beginning to change, and I realized that I was being shaped in some ways that probably I wasn't going to be Baptist for the rest of my life, but it didn't really begin to occur to me until the early 80s. I was still in seminary, and all the changes that were going on in Baptist life at that time made it clear, one, a woman who had aspirations perhaps to teach in a Baptist seminary probably was not going to be welcomed to do that. At least if the conservative takeover was going in the direction that it looked like it was going in 80 and 81 when I was graduating from seminary. But even then, I didn't make those shifts, those radical kinds of shifts. In Charlottesville, when I was at the University of Virginia, I went to the University Baptist Church there in Charlottesville for a while, but most of the time I went to St. Paul's Episcopal Church. And I was finding that my seminary background and my study of liturgy, and I was longing for something that I had not had in my Baptist upbringing. And I loved the liturgy. I will never forget my first Holy Week at St. Paul's Church in Charlottesville. Was just something I had never experienced. The Monday, Thursday service, they had a foot washing. Wow, you know, I had read about it. I had probably exegeted the passages in the New Testament, but I hadn't seen it. Hadn't been. When I saw Nathan Scott, he was also an ordained Episcopal priest, washing the feet of one of my student peers, I mean, that I was just blown away. I will never forget going to the Good Friday service, and the altar was stripped, and then going back for Easter. And it was ablaze in the glory of Easter morning in that setting. I probably knew then I was moving away from that Baptist identity. But I wasn't quite ready to make the break. And I went to Chapel Hill to University Baptist Church. Its worship was very liturgical and very formal. I loved that. I got to be the liturgist most Sundays in the services at the church. But by then it was 84, 86, and things were getting ugly for Baptist, especially for women in Baptist life. And so I left the Southern Baptist Church in 86 and joined an American Baptist Church, and that's different. But some Sundays I would also go to Chapel of the Cross, the Episcopal Church. So I was moving away. It just took a while to make the break. When I came here, I visited the Methodist Church, and I love John Wesley, and there's much about Methodism that really speaks to me. But I love the liturgy, and I was just hungry for that sacramental experience. And so I've been at St. Peter's most of the last 29 years.
And that is all the time we have. It's a good ending, Jane. Thank you very, very much.